Good afternoon and welcome, everybody. My name's Ethan. I'm an outreach coordinator at the Pulitzer Center. As we wait for more folks to join us, please let us know where you're listening in from. You can do that in the chat feature. Uh, the chat appears to be disabled. We had this last time. Let me go in. And apologies to all. We're going to wait a couple of more minutes here before we begin. So thank you all for joining and for your patience as well. I think we're going to go ahead and get started here. Apologies about the chat. If you haven't joined us before, I'm Ethan. I'm an outreach coordinator at the Pulitzer Center. The Pulitzer Center is a nonprofit journalism and education organization dedicated to raising awareness of underreported global issues. Last year, we supported 275 projects in collaboration with journalists, filmmakers, and news outlets around the world. We also work with classrooms and communities to extend the impact of the journalism and cultivate public engagement with these issues globally. You can learn more about our work in our 2022 annual report. A few logistics before we begin. You'll see a Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen, and you can begin adding your questions for speakers at any time throughout the opening discussion. There is also a chat icon. I know I will troubleshoot this as soon as we begin. I didn't want to take too much more time. And you can also feel free to use that Q&A chat. I'm able to see it if you do run into any technical issues. Live transcription is available to be turned on with the captions icon at the bottom of your screen. We want to let you know that we are recording this session and we'll post it online. And one other note, please stay a bit longer once the session ends to participate in a brief survey. I'm going to introduce the panelists briefly before I turn it over to our moderator, Lorena. Lorena O'Neill is a freelance journalist based in New Orleans. Her reporting focuses on stories that explore the intersection between identity, culture, race, and gender. She graduated from Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism. She reported on the indigenous people living in Louisiana's rapidly disappearing coast for Rolling Stone and the Pulitzer Center. Gina Castro is a social justice reporter based in Chicago, Illinois. She spent the past year reporting on reparations in Evanston, Illinois. She's currently investigating environmental racism in Latino neighborhoods in Chicago for 100 Latina Birthdays, a social podcast produced by LWC Studios. Castro graduated with a master in science journalism, science in journalism from Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism, specializing in investigative journalism. In 2022, she was a Pulitzer Center reporting fellow and reported on FEMA aid disparities, delaying hurricane recovery efforts for Louisiana's tribes. Devin Parfait is the chief of the Grand Cayuga-Dulac Band of Biloxi, Chitimacha, Choctaw, and a 22 graduate of Williams College, where he majored in geoscience. Throughout his undergraduate degree, he studied how coastal land loss is disproportionately affecting tribal communities in Southeast Louisiana. Parfait is currently working as a coastal resilience analyst for the Environmental Defense Fund and for the Mississippi River Delta Coalition, where he is working to support the Science Committee and to help advance justice for coastal communities. Elder Chief Sherelle Parfait Dardar is the former active traditional tribal chief of the Grand Cayuga-Dulac Band of Biloxi, Chitimacha, Choctaw, an ordained minister of the Universal Life Church, and an independent artist and small business owner. She is one of the founding members of the First Peoples Conservation Council of Louisiana and is currently seated as the president. She was also one of the advisors to ACT, establishing the Native American Commission, and was elected the first Native American chairwoman of the Louisiana Governor's Office of Indian Affairs Native American Commission. Dr. Alex Kolker is an oceanographer, geologist, and climate scientist. He has worked in coastal systems across the world, in the Gulf of Mexico, the Florida Everglades, along the Atlantic coast of the United States, and across North Africa. He received his PhD in Marine Atmospheric Sciences from Stony Brook University. He has served on National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine panels on the long-term evolution of the Gulf of Mexico, the Science Advisory Group for Louisiana's Climate Initiatives Task Force, and the Framework Development Team for the Louisiana 2017 Master Plan. I'm now going to hand it over to Lorena, who is going to be our moderator today.
Thanks, Ethan. Hi, everyone. We're so excited to have everybody here today. We're going to be showing this map of the Louisiana, the bottom of Louisiana where New Orleans is. And when everybody speaks, they can kind of use this in the beginning to orient you all, because I'm not assuming everybody on this call is an expert in Louisiana. Elder Chief Sherelle, could you start us out by speaking to your people's history and relationship with the land, and speak to the idea of subsistence living and traditional ecological knowledge?
Yes, thank you, Lorena, and really glad to be here with all of you today. All right, so what you're looking here on the map is an area of our homelands. Of course, there's a lot less of it now. Our people said that we've always been here in coastal Louisiana, and that's true. We are an indigenous people. Of course, our Chitimacha ancestors were already in the southern area of the state of Louisiana. And then during the Trail of Tears, or the Indian removal era, which was around the 1830s, our Choctaw and Biloxi ancestors, rather than going off to Oklahoma, they were issued Choctaw scripts to lands here in Louisiana, in coastal Louisiana. And of course, our Chitimacha and our Choctaw and Biloxi ancestors amalgamated way back in the early 1800s. And here we are today, still in our same homelands as we've always been. We are a traditional harvesting people. We live off of the lands and the waters. That was usually done by trapping, hunting, shrimping, crabbing, oystering. You know, we've always been a very self-sustaining people, we've always been thriving down in this area up until maybe the last couple generations. And of course, a lot of that has to do with many of the changes that have been taking place in our homelands over the many generations past. But as you can see on the map, the area of Dulac and Chauvin is our tribal jurisdiction. And just, I know I'm being biased, but to me, it's one of the best places to live in the whole world, right? You have everything you need here, and it's just a really wonderful place to be able to raise your children, especially being surrounded by, you know, your family and just generations of family, where they're able to hand down traditional ecological knowledge or the wisdom of the ancestors, right? And everything, and how to work, how to live, you know, how to sustain yourself. So that's where we are.
Thank you, Chief. Dr. Kolker, can you give a brief overview about geographic land loss in coastal Louisiana, while also speaking to both what makes it unique and how it connects more broadly to various climate change issues around the world?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's helpful to start by understanding how this whole system formed. The Mississippi River Delta, which is all of southeast Louisiana, was built by the Mississippi River. The Mississippi River carries an awful lot of sediment and fresh water, and when the river is in its main channel, it's bringing that fresh water down the river's channel, and then at some point, the river's channel meets an open bay or an open ocean, and the flow spreads out, and we get and the flow spreads out and slows down, and what you get is a fan-shaped deposit of land. Sometimes it's fan-shaped, sometimes you get teardrop-shaped islands, sometimes you get kind of fingers, almost might look like a duck's webbed feet with fingers and webbing in the middle. And so if you look at this map and you kind of look at where it says Houma, Dulac, Chauvin, and Old de Jean Charles, in some ways those long lines are kind of like the fingers of the old courses of the Mississippi River. And we call the old course of the Mississippi these sort of slow-moving streams or a slow-moving stream that is connected to the old course of the Mississippi River. Those we call bayous. Over time, and this area around Houma and Chauvin, that's about 1,000 or 1,500 years old, geologically speaking. Over time, the river would build up so much land that it would shift course and it would go somewhere else. And now the main course of the Mississippi River is where we see this today. It passes through New Orleans. It goes south of New Orleans, past what we see as Grand Bayou Village. And that's the main course of the Mississippi River. And this dynamic shifting of the Mississippi River created this very fertile landscape that we have in South Louisiana, or that we used to have. One major thing that's happened here is that there's been an enormous amount of land loss across the Delta. Something close to 2,000 square miles worth of land in Louisiana has converted from land to open water over the last century. That's enough land that if it was all in our current president's state of home state of Delaware, that state would be off the map. And so it's an enormous amount of land loss, and it's taken place for a couple of different reasons. It's taken place in part because Louisiana is sinking. Some of the reason that it's sinking is natural, but some of the sinking has been accelerated by the withdrawal of fluids, like either like deep fluids like oil and gas, or like shallow fluids like groundwater. Of course, there's also been a lot of canals that were constructed in Louisiana. Many of these canals were built for oil and gas extraction, but some were built for other purposes like navigation. And there's also the Mississippi River is now behind levees. So I told you it used to kind of flow somewhat freely and build land where it was entering a coastal bay. Now it doesn't really do that much anymore. The Mississippi River is mostly behind levees, and so it doesn't bring sediments and fresh water to the coast like it used to. There's some other things that play a role. Of course, oil spills, like the big BP oil spill that happened about 13 years ago, that played a role, as well as other oil spills, and now more recently things like climate change and more intense hurricanes also play a role. In some ways, this landscape is really unique because it's the mouth of the largest river in the country, and we don't have that many large river deltas in the U.S. But in some ways, it's not unique in that things like sea level rise and climate change are impacting communities all across the country. And Louisiana, because it's in the subtropics, because it's low-lying, because it's got a lot of water coming at it from a lot of different directions, is sort of on the leading edge of climate change. But one of the biggest reasons that people should pay attention to what's happening in Louisiana is what's happening here could take place in other coastal systems in other coastal systems in the years and decades ahead.
Thank you. That was a much needed explanation. It was perfect. Chief Devon, can you speak a bit about how this land loss that Dr. Kolker was talking about often disproportionately affects communities of color and other marginalized groups?
Yeah, so great to be here. Hi, everybody. So there's something that I always think about in Louisiana, and it's this phrase that if you travel, or the further you travel down the bayou, the higher the percentage of people of color in Louisiana. And that's especially true down in South Louisiana, where Indigenous people are amongst the front lines of this land loss issue, right along the coast on the furthest ends of the Louisiana Delta. And we've seen trends throughout the United States where communities of color, especially Indigenous communities, are pushed into what is considered unlivable lands. We've seen that with the Navajo tribe in the West, and then here in Louisiana, where we've had the Chitimacha, the Biloxi, and the Choctaw, who are all pushed to the southernmost ends of Louisiana, or what was considered unlivable lands at the time. And now we're seeing some of that play out now. In Louisiana, there's Southwest Louisiana and Southeast Louisiana. Southwest Louisiana is losing land at about a rate of 0.3% per year. Southeast Louisiana is losing about 0.4% of land each year. These communities, tribal communities, are situated in areas that are losing about 0.7% of lands per year, which is more than double the coastal rate. And so these Indigenous communities are situated in areas that are losing lands at a much more rapid pace. Traditionally, a lot of the tribal community would have depended on a subsistence way of living from the marshlands that existed and also the marshed woodlands that were there. But because of the land loss issue, we've seen that those woodlands have degraded over time. There are a lot of species that used to exist in Louisiana that no longer exist. I have a choker necklace. I don't have it here with me, but my grandpa made it and it had mink tail on it. And there used to be mink down here in Louisiana, but because of the land loss, they're now gone. And so we've seen a lot of these subsistence ways of living disappear along with the creatures and the ecosystems that are starting to collapse down south. We're also seeing a lot of ecosystems change. So Alex Kolker had mentioned earlier that there was a lot of carving up of the landscape due to oil and gas industry. And that carving up of the landscape has caused further erosion and degradations of the marshlands, but also has allowed saltwater intrusion to come in. And so we've seen these fresh, brackish marshes that used to be thriving estuaries and ecosystem for animals and seafood to be able to spawn have now been degraded. We've seen catch being lowered. There are also external pressures on tribal communities right now. We're seeing global imports beat out local shrimp prices. There's also a middleman between shrimpers down south, so they're not getting the right prices that they could have before. And then even further thinking about the history, a lot of Native Americans down south were forced into boarding schools where they were not allowed to get an education past the 8th grade, sometimes the 7th or 6th. And so you've had this global society formed around these Indigenous communities affect their physical ecosystems and also degrade culture, identity, landscape, and yeah, it's been affecting these tribal communities, and it's something that I've been studying. So,
Thanks, Chief. And speaking about land loss, we're going to go back to more specifics about coastal restoration projects and things like that in a little bit. But right now, I just wanted to talk about how we are heading into the worst weeks of hurricane season here, and yet there are still folks struggling from Hurricane Ida, which was 2 years ago. Gina, can you talk about the work you did reporting on FEMA aid challenges for the Pulitzer Center?
Yeah, definitely. So hi, everyone. I'm so excited to be here. It's been a little bit since I got to talk about this project, so I had to refresh myself. But so when I tackled this project last summer, I really wanted to look at how did FEMA, which is the Federal Emergency Management Agency, how they really tackled a great storm like Hurricane Ida, because that was a Category 4 storm that passed, I believe the eye went right over the Pontchartrain area, which I can't remember exactly where it is on the map, but it's nearby for sure. But so I wanted to know how did FEMA give aid to communities in Dulac and Chauvin? And so first, they'd establish these disaster recovery centers, and these usually take over some kind of business in the nearby area to help survivors navigate its disaster recovery assistance, as well as answer pressing questions. And the first of those disaster recovery centers were established in more of those populated parishes. And Louisiana is kind of different. It has parishes rather than counties, so they're kind of similar. But so those the first disaster recovery centers were established in Jefferson and Orleans parishes, but it took nearly a month for Terrebonne Parish to get a disaster recovery center in Houma, and that's still about a 30 or more minute drive from Dulac and Chauvin. So, and then when you also factor in how much debris is on the roads after a huge storm like that, and they had their vertical lift bridges were damaged, and so it made it really difficult and dangerous to travel up to a place like Houma. So for those communities in the more southern area of Terrebonne Parish, it was very difficult to travel to a disaster recovery center. But FEMA does have a system that is supposed to be prepared for situations like that when it's more difficult for those more vulnerable communities to travel up to them. So they have this process or this program called Disaster Survivor Assistance Teams. And it's just a way of really sending a little team of people with some tablets to go directly to those survivors and help them register. But register for FEMA aid. But the problem with that is that those teams need Wi-Fi and electricity to really get that job done. And let me see how long the area went without electricity. It was several months. Yeah, Terrebonne was out of electricity for a month or more. So if you obviously had no access to Wi-Fi. So it made it incredibly difficult for FEMA to get these people registered. So they were very much left to their own kind of devices. And, oh, I do have a stat. So according to a public record request that I had submitted to FEMA, the greatest number of people the disaster service survivor assistance team actually helped register was in Terrebonne, but it was only 893 people out of the 42,000 that applied, just to give you an idea.
Thank you, Gina. Elder Chief Sherrill has had a lot of experience with this directly, and so I was wondering if you could speak to the current and ongoing struggles you are still having with FEMA and talk both about the Indigenous Resilience Disaster Case Management Program you started and the Community Outreach Planning Office you're working on opening in order to help people in the community who may otherwise be left out of the conversation for some of the tech issues Gina was talking about, and others, like if you could expand on why a screenshot might stop somebody from getting help, for example.
No, absolutely. So, of course, the Indigenous Resilience Disaster Case Management Program, which is a very long word there, is something that we, of course, joined together with the other tribes within our region who were also impacted by Hurricane Ida, who found that our communities were having an extremely difficult time navigating the FEMA application, like just getting in an application, right? It was a challenge, but also once the applications were submitted, then the appeals process began. And that was an absolute nightmare for some families, right? Because you have to think these are advanced systems. These are technical systems that have been created. And you have communities that are aging populations that were prevented from having a full education, right? So not only are they already struggling with different forms of illiteracy, but now you're expecting them to go through this extremely technical process that they can't even access without Wi-Fi, much less, having some serious expertise in understanding some of the language there. It just posed so many challenges. That one instance I can recall, and this is going to haunt me probably for the rest of my life, is we had a client that had to keep reappealing 6 times, right? And it was because people were utilizing the only technology that they had when they were requesting documentation. The only thing that they had access to was a phone. So they would screenshot, right? And take a picture of the document and try to send that to, they tried to upload it to the system that they were required to upload it to, not knowing that that screenshot was not readable on the other end. So rather than someone taking 30 seconds to make a phone call to this client to say, hey, we can't see a JPEG, right? We need it in a PDF format so that we can actually see it. No one did that. And we saw that time after time after time with appeal after appeal after appeal, where it was something that was very minor, but they did not fully explain what the problem was, right? So rather than just them having to resubmit something really simply, then they were required to go through the whole appeals process again. And that is not a challenge you want to be made to go through after a disaster. All right. Like, you are already struggling as it is. And so on top of that, we've come up with the COPO. We have the Community Outreach Program Office at Grand Cayudulac. We picked up a damaged residence. The homeowner decided to move, and we're currently working to convert that into a resilience hub where people in the community can come and get access to information, access to resources, get assistance with applying for FEMA applications should there, when there's another disaster, not should there, we know that's going to happen. But also everyday things, right? Like if they need to be able to navigate applying for SNAP benefits, or if maybe they need a tutor, maybe they need information on how to do resilient repairs to their home, right? We want this to have, to be a place where community residents can come to get access to the resources that they so desperately need, rather than having to go 35, 45 minutes across town when many of the people are already having challenges regarding transportation, right? These resources are needed in the community. So we are actively trying to get that going. We're already behind schedule, because we're also learning the permitting process with all of those things. But we're moving forward. So we're really hoping that we can have that up and running before the winter time this year.
And hey, I'll just add, thank you for sharing that. I'll just add, just for a little bit of sort of broader environmental context on Hurricane Ida for people out there that aren't familiar with it, because sometimes I think people outside of Terrebonne haven't heard much about it. 2 of the 3 most powerful storms to hit Louisiana in European recorded history since about 1850 occurred in 2020 and 2021, and that was Hurricane Ida, which hit south central Louisiana in 2021, and Hurricane Laura that hit southwest Louisiana in 2020. Ida was really large. It made landfall as a Category 4 storm. You had hurricane force winds over an area close to like 10,000 square miles. You had intense winds down in Grand Isle, and you had hurricane force winds in like the Mississippi River parishes, which sometimes people call the sort of Cancer Alley region. Those areas are 75, 80 miles apart, and you had hurricane force winds in those areas. So it was really one of the largest storms to hit Louisiana on record. And of course, we know that Louisiana gets some of the biggest storms in the country. So you had damage in the Terrebonne region and in many of the other nearby parishes as well. So
Thanks, Dr. Kolker. We got a question into the webinar chat Just a reminder that if y'all can put it in the Q&A so everybody can see it, because I think the chat's not really working very well. But I'm going to read it out. Rochelle asks, can you explain how a lack of federal recognition further excludes tribal citizens from receiving the emergency assistance they need? Chief Sherrill, would you like to take that one, or Chief Devin?
I can start a little bit, and then Chief, feel free to jump in and add whatever you want. So Native Americans in the United States exist in a tiered recognition system where you're either unrecognized, state recognized, or federally recognized. And each tier of this recognition system allows you access to more resources. Now, typically the way it works is the better you are with paperwork and the more capacity you have, the better able you are to go and reach out for these resources. When it comes to the federal government, because we're not a federally recognized tribe yet, we don't get called or recognized as a tribal community. We are marginalized or disadvantaged, but we are not formally recognized by the United States as a tribal community. Now, we know we're tribal, we know we're indigenous, and we know our history, but the United States, we have to prove that to even get that kind of recognition. And for FEMA, to be able to get direct federal assistance, or the way it's worked before, is that we needed to be a federally recognized tribe. Now, it's totally an executive decision about how those things go, and we're seeing that play in different federal agencies. The EPA, for example, is really good. They recognize you whether or not you are federally recognized, whether you're unrecognized, state recognized, federal, doesn't matter. If you're indigenous and you're a person of the United States, you deserve assistance and help, especially from the federal government, and they see that through. But the problem now is that other federal agencies are lacking in that. It's, it can be kind of tough to form relationships and to also get direct federal assistance, because people kind of go and say, oh, you're not federal. They put the arm out, you're not federally recognized. We've seen that with the state government, where we go even to the state and have asked for assistance before, and they put the arm out and saying, oh, you need to be federal. And so this tiered recognition system where we have to prove who we are normally prevents us access to resources. I don't know if you want to add more.
No, thank you, Chief. That was a beautiful explanation. I mean, and just to add to what Chief Devin said about yet, we have been in the federal acknowledgement process now for over 27 years. We are working with a team of experts right now to complete our concise written narrative, what I like to call the bedtime story. So not only is all of the evidence that we were required to provide enough, they also want it put into a concise written narrative now. So, and those rules do change, and they have changed on us twice since we've been going through that process. So we're really hoping that we will complete, this process very soon, because it's been a long time.
Thank you, Chief. There's a question in the Q&A about the diversion, and I wanted to kind of briefly describe that first. On Thursday, Louisiana is breaking ground on the largest coastal restoration project in the country. It's the $2.2 billion Mid-Barataria sediment diversion. It will cut a hole in a levee reconnecting the Mississippi River to the marshes south of the greater New Orleans metro area. Dr. Coker, can you talk briefly about the benefits of this and how this is expected to create more land?
Yeah, so the Mid-Barataria, so remember how at the beginning of this, I told you that the way that we build land in South Louisiana, or historically land was built in South Louisiana, was through the Mississippi River, where the Mississippi River would carry a lot of sediment and fresh water. And when the river entered an open bay, the flow would spread out, the water would slow down, and sediment would settle out into kind of fan and teardrop shaped islands. And this doesn't happen very much in most of the Delta, because the river is behind levees. The Mid-Barataria diversion, the idea is to sort of mimic the natural processes that built land in this area, and carry a lot of sediment and fresh water to a coastal bay that's about 30 miles south of New Orleans, and this bay is called Barataria Bay. And so it'll be a series of gated structures, sort of like a water control structure with gates, that will let water and sediment from the Mississippi River flow into this estuary Barataria Bay. It's a very, sustainable, long-term way to build land. Scientists have been thinking about this idea for almost 50 years, but it will have impacts. So for example, it'll probably change the habitat from saltwater to freshwater. And things like oysters tend to like clear salty water, and they don't like sort of fresh turbid water. So you could change the habitat that would make it less conducive for some things like oysters. And I think that I'll leave it to Chief Devin and Elder Chief Sherrill to talk about how that might impact people in the area.
Yeah, so we have this big diversion that's happening in Louisiana, but there's also a lot of concerns around it too. It has the potential to build a lot of land, to change ecosystems and restore it to what it once was. But we're also dealing with a history of injustice in Louisiana. We've had a government that hasn't really worked for the people in the ways that it should, and historically have left out tribal communities, have left out marginalized group, people of color. And so you have this big sediment diversion that is being implemented that is, like Lorena said, $2.2 billion. And throughout this process, there hasn't been really robust community engagement, being able to effectively communicate the science of the diversions, talk about the ecosystems change. And one of the biggest problems is that the ecosystem will change. Specifically for Grand Bayou, that's right next to the sediment diversion. This is a tribal community that has subsisted off the land for thousands of years. And because of the colonization, the landscape has fundamentally changed because of the carving up of the landscape, and the ecosystems change. And the community has had to adjust and deal with that burden of landscape and ecosystem change. And now we're dealing with the forces of more development. So the diversion is happening, could build more land, but it is also fundamentally changing the ecosystem around the area. And for a community that has already had to deal with a bunch of impacts on their ecosystem, this is another impact that they will have to deal with in the future. Also, there is a liquid natural gas plant being built right next to the diversion in the community. It's the largest liquid natural gas plant in the US, but it might be the world. Maybe one of you guys can clarify more. But there's a big question about, what happens if something happens with this LNG plant where it ends up polluting the water, and you have the Mississippi River diversion diverting more of that pollution into the ecosystem. There are lots of questions and concerns, and I think for me, whenever I think about this and talk to people, there are kind of two narratives that come up about this possibility for a really bold and creative idea to help restore our natural ecosystems in Louisiana and to help build up more land so we can think about ecosystem and landscape restoration long term. But there are also the impacts to people and identity and what's going on right now. So I think that's where a lot of the community concerns come from is, people in Louisiana, especially those who are fishermen and have relied on the waters for their income and their sustenance, are going to see a big ecosystems change. And I think part of why there is so much positivity and negativity around the diversions is the lack of good communication about the science and a robust community engagement process with the tribal communities, who are the ones who are most interconnected with the lands in Southeast Louisiana.
Thank you, Chief. On that note, I'm going to open it up to Q&As if you guys want to add more questions in. We have one here. Can panelists talk about the impacts on schools, state education of what has been discussed here, if this is part of the research worked on? Chief Sherrill.
Chief, do you want to talk about that? I think you can provide some good words on that.
No, absolutely. So recently we've been experiencing our schools closing down, right? For multitude of reasons that have been listed, from a decline in the population, which means there's less students to go to the schools in the community. Our sister tribe community, Pointe-au-Chien community lost their school first. And then of course after Ida, Grand Caillou was at risk of losing theirs. Now, from what I can understand, there's been some talks and they're supposed to do some repairs to the school in our area, but we have not seen that actually happen yet. So I'm hesitant to scream that success without actually seeing it come through. Okay. Especially seeing what they've been doing, not just in, like our sister tribal area of Pontchartrain, but even in areas such as Jefferson, like we've seen some school closures happening around those areas as well. And those are things that we as a community take very seriously and that we've been actively working to address. We've taken the time to actually go and look at other schools outside of our own area that are similar to our communities, but are actually utilizing the type of system that's good for their particular community, right? So while we do know that there's a very high chance that our schools will eventually be shut down, right? Especially if we continue to get damaging storms, then we are considering other options as far as what we can do to keep, active schools in our communities where they need to be, based on the needs of the community.
And maybe just one thing I'll add to that, just on the numbers perspective. The U.S. Census came out with numbers earlier this year on population loss or population change in U.S. counties nationwide between 2021 and 2022, and 3 of the top 4 counties, or as we call them parishes here in Louisiana, 3 of the top 4 counties in the country to lose people were South Louisiana parishes in the line of Ida. And so I think Terrebonne was number 2 in the entire country, and then Plaquemines, and I believe it was maybe St. John's were the other in the top 4. So and the number 1, I think, was a California county that experienced a lot of wildfires. And so climate is becoming an issue. Is linked to a reason why people leave. It may not be the only thing, and there are a lot of other factors, but I think that is one very interesting data point.
Thank you, Dr. Kolker. We have another question. It says, how will the DOI's plan to place offshore wind turbines along the coast affect Louisiana's coastal tribes?
I don't know too much about the entirety of the plans. I know that I've been contacted by people from NWF, the National Wildlife Federation. It could be connected to the DOI, but we had a conversation about offshore wind. I think the person from NWF was kind of, from the conversations, I think we're kind of leading some of those efforts. And so the fact that she reached out to me and wanted to have a conversation and talk about what I thought about offshore wind, where I think the money should go. I remember we had a good, robust conversation about it, but I haven't heard much about it since. So I'm not too sure, but we've been contacted about it. So yeah, that's pretty nice.
And just as a little bit broader context, so most offshore, until now, all of offshore energy and the offshore energy industry is a big part of South Louisiana economy. All of offshore energy, up until now, has basically been oil and gas drilling. And as we all try and think about how we get off greenhouse gases, one thing that's emerged is wind and offshore wind. There are, essentially offshore resources, wind resources in the Gulf of Mexico, and the arm of the federal government that normally hands out oil and gas leases is beginning to think about how do we hand out leases for offshore wind turbines. Their first phase of leases to figure out what areas to lease out. They did like essentially like a deconfliction analysis. They looked at all of the uses in the Gulf of Mexico, as well as where the wind was strong and where it wasn't strong, and came up with an area that they thought had the fewest conflicts. Now, I think there's still reason to keep eyes on that, and I don't know if it's going to resolve every conflict, but I think that their intention was to find an area that had the fewest conflicts. And I think we probably need to hear more from from communities to make sure they got it right. But that is the plan. And there's some thought that offshore wind is a renewable source of energy that maybe works with like the economy here in South Louisiana, because a lot of people that have worked on things like oil rigs could probably have the skills to work on things like offshore wind. So that's sort of the context of it. But it is also sort of one of the newer elements here in South Louisiana. And I think there's probably a lot of reason to continue to keep talking about it.
Especially with LK99. I don't know if anybody's heard about that in the chat. The room temperature superconductor may change technology. People are conversing about it. I don't know, really interesting conversation right now.
We have another question from Grace. How do you hold FEMA and the federal government accountable for climate disaster aid in marginalized communities? I'm from Michigan and thinking also of how flood disaster relief in Detroit comes slower than in affluent white areas. Do you think that bringing attention to these issues can help bring better government aid, or are you more focused on community-based aid? I think that if Chief Sherrill, I know we already briefly spoke about FEMA, but if you could speak to how you have had to just sort of, and other Indigenous communities and other coastal communities have had to kind of come together for community-based aid. And a point that you've made to me in the past that I think is really important is that as we know, climate change is exacerbating more things and there are more natural disasters happening, which is putting a bigger strain on FEMA overall. If you could just speak to sort of what you have done while not getting aid.
Absolutely. The truth of the matter is, right, with everything that we can see that's going on, not just where we are, but globally, okay, all of these systems that we have become very dependent upon are being further strained, right, including FEMA, okay, like, they're not just dealing with hurricanes, they're also dealing with wildfires and every other disaster that has been taking place increasingly in our nation, right? So FEMA's system is severely strained. That was very evident during Ida, but as a community, in any community, we did not have the time to wait to hope that FEMA would make its revisions and find a way to solve the inner working, challenges that they're having. We literally had to join up with our sister tribes and other communities and network and advocates to be able to respond to recovery on our own, right? While waiting for those systems to be able to kick in. And with the understanding that no system is perfect, right? So a lot of what we've been doing is rebuilding our own systems. Our ancestors had these systems in place on a community level, for us on a tribal level, right? And they each communicated with their sister tribes, right? And we're having to go back to a lot of those systems while we try to address the challenges with the other systems that we've been so dependent on. And it's not just FEMA, we're starting to see that in many, many other areas as well. Food security, education, right? Even healthcare, as a good example. My name is Treter de Tad, that means healer of the land. My grandfather was a healer. I'm a healer of sorts. My great grandmother was a healer. We had our own medicinal plants, right? So rather than always having to go to the doctor or something when it wasn't accessible, you had traditional ecological knowledge for those medicinal plants to heal some of your ailments. So we're even having to look back towards some of those things, right? So it's just having to understand that under all of the strain that our environment is now facing, the systems that we depend upon are also extremely strained. So we're going to have to get very creative and lean on each other while we're trying to navigate these things.
And I think this goes to a lot of the work that your tribe has been doing. Chief Devon, if you could speak to how a lot of your focus in your job, both your job and your job as chief, has been trying to make it more accessible for coastal communities to provide feedback. Can you talk about the barriers that exist when the government conducts community outreach programs and discuss the importance of accessible language and kind of getting things that are community first oriented?
Yeah, so one of the way that we are trying to deal with complex problems these days, especially when it comes to complex environmental problems, is just like Sherelle said, just getting with each other and being creative. And the processes for community engagement don't really allow for those creative conversations to really happen. The way we've seen outreach happen before is that you'll take an institution like maybe the Army Corps, for example, who will come into communities and present information, and often present it in an inaccessible way. So we've seen them recently come down. So I'll back up for a second. So I ended up facilitating a meeting between CPRA, the Army Corps, and tribal leaders. And basically the meeting was just getting us together in a room to sit around a table and just have a conversation. And we had a really good conversation, and we had a tribal leader who normally doesn't speak in these kinds of meetings, spoke a lot and was able to get a lot off their chest and to have conversations. And some things that I heard from that meeting is that, wow, this was a really great meeting, and this is something that shouldn't be a special occasion, but it should be something that's normalized and standardized. And we're seeing a lot of that happen. And so the meeting that I facilitated ended up spawning this environmental justice outreach meeting by the Army Corps, which is the first time they'd ever done anything like that in 12 years in Louisiana. And whenever they came to the community or they came down south, they presented it in an inaccessible way, which is basically how they've done for a really long time, which is, they use language that's inaccessible like EIS. EIS is not a term that I learned until I really started getting into the nonprofit world, which means environmental impact statement. But they'll use terms that to them are very normalized and standardized, but if they're trying to do environmental outreach to communities and community members, that kind of language just goes over people's heads, and then they can't engage with the presentation that people are getting. The other problem too is that they don't really understand where the good stakeholders are. So within that meeting, we didn't see other tribal communities, we didn't see LumCon get involved, CRCL, which is the Coalition to Restore Coastal Louisiana. I'm wearing their shirt right now. And they're the ones that work with my coalition of nonprofits and are very, very involved in what's going on down in Terrebonne, in South Louisiana, where the tribes are situated. And they also wanted feedback two-dimensionally. So often they'll go present information and then they'll expect feedback. Okay, here's a written form that you can write down feedback and then we'll take it, which often brings a direct barrier to people because they either need to write their thoughts down or write it afterwards and then send it in. And that gets rid of that creative conversation process that spawns natural ideas, robust conversations, and good input in that moment. And so a lot of the work that I've been doing is just trying to rethink about how we do community engagement in Louisiana, developing and building relationships with other nonprofits, also government institutions like CPRA, and also the Army Corps, continuing to develop their method of community engagement, because it really will take bold, creative solutions and good conversations for us all to come together and think creatively and be in conversation and community with one another. The way that oftentimes these processes and then these institutions have worked have been from a very top-down view, where they are the ones coalescing the science and the knowledge. They make the decisions, and by the time the decisions are already made, done, and over with, their method of community engagement is going to the communities and saying, what do you think about this? And then leaving, and then maybe getting feedback and not responding to the feedback in any kind of robust or meaningful way. And that's kind of what I said earlier about this history of injustice in Louisiana, where people are looking at these diversion projects And there hasn't been a lot of good, robust communication with the communities that exist all across the Delta. And so something else that I'm doing now is I'm hosting tomorrow a Terrebonne Coastal Visioning Workshop that will bring people together from local government, from state government like CPRA, the Coastal Protection Restoration Authority, and then also local scientists like Alex Kolker, who will be attending, and then also community leaders like Chief Sherrill and I, and then other members of other tribal leaders, just to get us all in conversation together, see what everybody's doing on the coast, what timelines look like, what opportunities we have to do more marsh plantings, also living shorelines. So that's when you take old oyster shells, you put them in a bag and you create an artificial reef that can help solidly protect coastlines. And then also something I'm working on is canal backfilling. So all of those canals that were dug up along Louisiana's landscape, there's a cheap and effective process of just pushing back those spoil banks, which was the dirt that was dug and shoved on the sides, into the marshlands to allow for the lands to reheal themselves. And this is the first time something like this is happening. I think there's been efforts before to bring in a bunch of different scientists together, but not people from all across sectors, nonprofit, government, community leaders, and members. And I'm hoping that this can provide a good sample or idea of what it looks like to bring multiple stakeholders in and just get together and have a good conversation where there's not like some strict agenda. We have things and subjects that we want to hit on and get through with the meeting, but not something that feels constrained and confined and so official. It's also going to be a potluck event where people can come and show off their recipes, bake cookies, bring a meal. And it's a chance to restructure how we do community engagement, which is to be in community with each other. And it's not just this top down, send us this written letter about what you think about this project. It's what do you think? And like, how do you feel about it? And so, yeah, I mean, and this goes even further here in the US, where we've seen tribal communities be left out of decision-making around the environment that they have supported and are supported by for thousands of years. And so there's a growing effort. There's several different terms, reparations, which Gina can speak more about. There's also rematriation of the land, which is returning it to indigenous matriarchy. And part of that is just helping to restore tribal sovereignty and self-determination. And part of that is engaging tribal communities and meeting tribal communities where they're at in their capacity, not expecting them to bring capacity to you, but helping to bring capacity to the communities so that the tribal sovereignty and land determination, land self-determination can be respected. And when these projects happen, tribal communities are aware of them and can also help contribute to the knowledge base. Like, just think, there could be projects that could affect one species, one fish species. And let's say you have an institution like CPRA, who is looking at different scientific studies, looking at overall fish species, migration, movement, habitat, but you're only getting small slices of time. Whereas if you talk to the fishermen who are out on that boat, out on that water every single day and understand those fish and where they move and go, and you combine that with the modern science, you get a much more robust conversational data set that can help be used to make context-specific decisions about our environment. That includes everybody. There's also this question of an allocation of resources. We are dealing with this broad philosophical mindset that we can pursue unlimited growth. When I started learning about stocks, they say that you should invest in a company long-term that's making about 10% profits every single year. But when does that stop? When does that end? And so we're dealing with these philosophies that are underpinning our institutions that are preventing us from fully engaging with our ecosystems. There was this growing movement to return back to nature, go on a hike, go outside, get back to nature. But the undeniable truth is that we all live in nature already on Mother Earth. And so we cannot choose whether or not to be a part of our environment. And so if these indigenous philosophies about living sustainably with the environment, or even further regeneratively with the environment, then tribal sovereignty needs to be respected in the future, especially to deal with the history of injustice that we've seen throughout the United States. That definitely has an impact on how we experience life in the modern day.
You see why he became chief? We're gonna just go a few minutes over, just to speak to reparations a little bit, is something that Chief Devon spoke about. Gina, can you talk about the work you're doing in Chicago that could help possibly provide tips for climate justice reparations?
Yeah, definitely. So Evanston, it's a town just north of Chicago, the suburb in Illinois still, but it made history in 2019 because it established the first form of local reparations for its Black residents. But it's also the first example of local reparations by a city government ever in the US. And so just a quick explanation of how they did that. They're using, so reparations by definition is to repair harm. And that could be so many other things. That could be financial, that could be an education program. The list is, really long as you're applying creativity. And they're using in Evanston, they're using sales from their cannabis dispensary to fund reparations for housing. Because one of the big issues that they found was a history of redlining in their city actually impacted the life expectancy of their Black community. It's caused massive displacement of their Black community. And so their first wave of the reparations program is focused on housing. So it gives $25,000 grants to eligible residents so that they can purchase a home and stay in their community. But what it's really made is an option for any community, any city in the US to find a way to repair the harm that happened to a marginalized community, which could be, natives here in Louisiana. And another community just next to Evanston, it's called Oak Park. Their reparations program has, they're still like building it, but what it's been focused on is actually education, because there's been a history of their Black history being removed, and people have even forgotten how did Black people even get to Oak Park. So they're trying to find ways to not only collect all that history, but also make sure it's put into their school districts. So just hearing from our conversations today, like what Elder Chief Sherrill mentioned about the history of elders in the tribes not having equal access to education, like that could be something that the county or the parish could do, is create ways so that people, the youth in that in the tribes, can learn about their community and learn about their culture and learn about those medicinal practices that you mentioned, Elder Chief Sherrill. And but it could also be financial reparations, because I know when I was out there reporting, there were so many examples of how the oil rigs conned people into selling them their land. Because many natives at the time couldn't read, so they were signing contracts that they weren't aware of what the limits of the contract would be, which would be taking their land, unfortunately. But like it could be a form of repaying that back too. And then one example I did think about was I remember, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I remember it was Panashin who got a French school. Like that could be something too, like teaching people French in the community again. But it's another opportunity to be creative and think about like just how that system could even be established in this community, and how much it'd be beneficial for people who have issues with their identity because of displacement. Like I remember when I was learning so much about Chief Devon's story and how much he had to move around because of the hurricanes, and just how much that would just be so much, racial healing.
We appreciate all of you for joining us today, especially to the panelists. I'm really grateful for your words, and for those of you who are able in the audience, please consider becoming a Pulitzer Center champion to support our work. You can go online to pulitzercenter.org/give. Finally, before I close out this meeting, we will issue you a survey in the post attendee link. And we'd really, really appreciate it if you could take the time to fill it out. It helps us improve our events, make them, with less friction and a little bit more accessible. So thank you so much for joining today. And we hope to see you again soon. Thank you.